So once again, welcome to the Global Engagement Survey Community of Practice. Really excited to welcome Anika Venezia as our guest speaker here for our April 2026 session. Anika is from the East Bay in California, double majoring in sociology and political science with a concentration in peace, justice, and human rights. She's a third-year student, and with the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship at Haverford College, if I got that right, her role includes assisting with ongoing projects, supporting the office with events, and doing research with the GES. Anika also is a former research assistant with the community-based Global Learning Collaborative. I had the honor of working with Anika for about a year or longer. And Annika's very busy outside of her student roles as well, with pets and outdoor pursuits. So, welcome, Anika. Thanks so much for presenting to us today.
Thank you for that introduction. And as Mike mentioned, I am a student at Haverford College and I was an undergraduate research assistant for the GES. And I was lucky enough to have some of my time overlap with Mike's. I was connected to the collaborative through Haverford Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, as Mike mentioned, which was directed by Eric Hartman, who you might know. And he got me started on a qualitative research project with GES data based at Haverford. It was just with Haverford's GES data, and it was with a group of three other students. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the process of sort of what that looked like to have a group of undergraduate student researchers working with GES data and just doing qualitative analysis. This was a 2 semester long project. It was 1 semester and then the summer as well. And what we ended up creating was a report that included an analysis of Haverford's data set as well as some recommendations for future programming. I know, as you mentioned in your introductions, which were super helpful, I know everyone is coming from a different place as far as experience with qualitative research, and I'm super excited about that. I think just generally goals for this presentation. Instead of like teaching you exactly how to go about qualitative research, I don't have the qualifications to do that, but I want to explain what the process looked like for me as a student and what it can look like to have student researchers do qualitative analysis on GES data and maybe even for you get a sense of direction of what that could look like if that's possible at your institution or within your center. All right, so just a brief overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory behind the qualitative research methodology that we used, a little bit about coding, about mapping and data visualization, about analyzing the data, and then how we wrote the report. And then I also want to touch on student voice a little bit and why I think it mattered that we were all student researchers, and also specifically that some of us were students who had been involved in the global learning programs that were assessed with the GES. So first, to talk a little bit about theory, Eric Hartman introduced our group to the grounded theory method, which basically means that we were looking at raw data, coding this data cyclically and collaboratively, and analyzing student responses to examine themes within the data set. It was a very iterative process. I took this image from the video that Eric had us watch. I can send out these slides later, and the video is linked if anyone is curious. It's a very short and helpful video just to get oriented in grounded theory, but it's just the cyclical process of collecting and analyzing data. Just to make that a little bit more tangible, what that means is you're beginning with the raw data. You don't start with theory and then you derive theory from this raw data. So the process can look like coding and then grouping themes and then mapping and visualizing themes and then creating a written report. And this is particularly helpful when there's no existing theory or maybe there's an incomplete theory. So like where we're starting with our GES data is a scattering of student responses, and then we're building up a theory or a set of recommendations for programming from that data. I wanted to ask a couple of quick questions while we're here. This grounded theory is a particular method, but there are other methods where you start with theory and then you use your data to either verify or debunk a theory. You're putting that theory to test. I took a qualitative sociology class last semester that was very against the grounded theory method, and was very passionate about starting with theory as something that can inform your research. So I was curious if anyone, either based on experiences with qualitative research or just based on this conversation so far, has a sense of when it would make sense to start with the data and build a theory from that data, or if it makes more sense to start with theory and test that theory with the data. And you're welcome to unmute if you have any ideas. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily. It's just curious about impressions.
With Anika, with the caveat that it's now been 20 plus years since I took research methods, and qualitative research is not my forte. I would say that, you know, like I understand, like I remember from I understand why you got pushback on that, but I also understand the value of this approach. And so I would say, if you pursue publishing this work, what you would want and need to do regardless is to root it in the literature and the scholarship. And so root it in the literature and scholarship of the approach that you're using. So find people who use the grounded theory approach and defend your work or position your work in that vein, in that intellectual vein. In other words, as you've been trained, what are the benefits, and really hone in on that while also acknowledging honestly, what are the limitations? Because and this would hold in social science data for qualitative and quantitative research, the danger or fear is that if you don't start with a theory, then it's just sort of you're looking for something and kind of proofing using the data, and that might bias your findings. But I think for something like this, it makes sense to look for patterns in the comments and then explore further. It might mean that you need to do additional work like focus groups, for example. And that's a question I have if there's time later, because that's kind of where I'm at with our qualitative data.
Yeah, that was really helpful. We'll have a discussion period at the end, and I'd love to hear more about that and chat. All right. I'm gonna move on from talking about theory, and we'll talk a little bit about the process side of this. So starting with coding. So when we begin in our qualitative research group, with this process, we just started with the Google Sheets spreadsheet that Mike gives everyone that has all of the qualitative data for your institution for a given survey cycle. I put color blocks over this data just because it's our institution's data. But essentially, how we organize our codes in our small group for qualitative research was that we just made a copy of this official document from Mike, and then we coded within questions for themes. Um, I used color coding. I would just fill in each cell with a different color based on the theme. So this is what my doc looked like at one point. You can see it's not always, I'm not always coloring every box. It depends on the themes that I notice, but this is just one example. Um, and then on a separate Google Doc, I would organize my themes just so I would remember if I only had this, I would look back at it in a couple of weeks and be like, what does purple mean? So here's where I would decode and write what purple means. On a separate Google Doc, I would record each theme, and then underneath each theme, I would put sub bullet points for sub themes and then list the most relevant or representative quotes from the data set, directly from student responses, sort of as evidence of these themes. One other thing that I want to mention is that on this sheet, I'm coding by question. But another thing that we looked out for in our research group was changes between pre-post surveys. So we looked for themes in the entire data set within each question, but then also looking at the same question within matched cases for pre-post responses and seeing if there were differences in the students' responses before and after their global learning program. Now we'll talk a little bit about mapping. So, the team at the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship introduced me to Mindomo. We never figured out exactly how you're supposed to say it, but that's how it's spelled. And it's a mapping tool and visualization tool that you can use to make mind maps like this. Again, I blurred it just because it has some student responses in there. But essentially, how we use this tool was we took each scale. So I have the global citizenship one here. And then each question within that scale and pasted it into a mind map. And then for each question, we put a few themes, maybe like 4 to 5, and then around 2 to 4 quotes as evidence of those themes. So this was a way that while we were still kind of doing this individual work, we mapped it out to help collaborate in visualization. So after we had these maps, we joined together as our group of four, and then also with support from our supervisors at the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. And we talked about what themes we had in common, what themes were different, why that might have been. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides. But at this point, we were visualizing the themes that we'd found within our qualitative data set and put our heads together and considered what might be most useful for analysis.
Anika, is it okay? I've interrupted you already, but I'm curious. So the themes, right? And this maybe is connected to the grounded theory. So you didn't start with themes. Did you like, or did you start with themes and then whenever you saw a theme, you coded it? Or did you read and then like, oh, that looks like a theme? Did the themes emerge out of the reading, or did you start with themes and then code what you were writing to those themes?
For me, the theme started with the reading. So, what my process looked like was I read through the responses to each question within the qualitative data sheet. And then, after one read through, I sort of had a sense of what responses looked like. And then I would go back and I would code. So, I guess maybe a sort of a combination of both. I would get a sense of what the themes might be. And then, on a second read through, I would start writing, taking note of those themes and being more systematic about it.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And anyone is welcome to jump in at any time with questions, and I'll make time for discussion at the end. But I see Francine. Do you have a
Yes,
question?
and I think you've answered, well, you have answered it. But it relates to Mike's question, which is, did you did you go in with like themes that you hope to see, or was it really like, I have no idea. Let's see what's there. And
Yeah. That's a good question. I think for me, because I'd had a year and a half of working with the GES at that point, and I kind of had it set in my mind of like, this is exactly what I'm gonna see. I already know what I'm gonna find. And I was mostly wrong about that, but some things were definitely familiar to me. So I think I kind of went in also with a little bit of knowledge about what I was most interested in looking for. And I was one of my surprises, which I'll talk about in a second, is that within just the team of four, we had very different interests and we were pulled in very
Mm,
different directions, which I think is why it was so interesting to do this work as a group.
thank you.
All right. So, a little bit about analyzing the data. Once we had these maps, we turned to analyzing and thinking about writing our final report. So, we found the codes and the themes that we had in common. One conversation that we had a lot was about positionality. We were a diverse group of students, it was half international students. I'd worked with the GES before, and I had been a student in one of the global learning programs that takes the GES. So I was familiar with the system, and then a couple of the other students had taken the GES with their classes, and I believe one student hadn't taken the GES before. So we were coming from a place that I think was actually really special for a group of four to be doing this research because we all read different things into the data set and we all had different leanings and were pulled in different directions in terms of themes that we were most intrigued by and interested in analyzing. So when we came together as a group, we found that there was some overlap between the themes that we'd noticed in the data set. And this was important for us to take note of because those were the themes that we knew were pretty striking if all of us had noticed them in the data set. But then there were also things where I was like, maybe I noticed this because I'm connected to either this identity or this experience that this respondent had, and that's why it sticks out to me in particular. So those were some interesting conversations that we had in the process, and I think were pretty helpful when we decided how to divide up the report writing, and create a piece that was reflective of kind of our all of our analyses. Then we decided to write about themes of particular interest and relevance. So, like, for example, what I focused on was how experiential learning prompted students to create concrete action plans for future advocacy. And this was something that I think I'd noticed as a theme in other GES related research that I'd done before with Mike and with Caitlin Ferrarini before that. So it was something that I was pretty immediately looking for and interested in the data set. So that was what I wrote about. And we all wrote about different things just based on personal interests and also tried to hone in on implications for programming so that we were creating a piece of research that was not only like interesting for us, but could also help the center create next steps for the programs that students were reflecting on in their GES responses. So then we started writing the report. This is just a very brief outline of what the format looks like. If anyone has has done qualitative research, either like just in their free time or for a journal or like a PhD program or any level of qualitative analysis, this might look familiar. So we learned this from Steph at Haverford's CPGC, and we got to look at her thesis or her PhD dissertation a little bit, which was really very cool and helpful. So we started with an introduction and methods. We talked about findings, and sort of how we structured this was we would state a theme, like the one I mentioned about like experiential learning leading to concrete action plans for advocacy. That would be the theme. And then we'd pull a quote or two, analyze those quotes, and connect it back to the theme, and then talk about some implications for the programming and like bigger picture, what does this actually mean or indicate for the program? Then we had a section that was just on recommendations for future programming based on what we found. Haverford also has a post fellowship, which is their global learning program, like a post fellowship course that students are required to take, both before and after their global learning experiences. And so our recommendations also included an analysis of student feedback for that class and what that class was like to them. So we included our recommendations for that too, and then we just had a conclusion summarizing everything. Any questions before we move on away from process a bit? Does anyone have any questions about the qualitative research process and what that looked like?
I'm curious, Anika, with the findings, the theme, the quote, and I know, doing qualitative research in some ways, how did you wrestle with like preventing the qualitative from becoming quantitative? Like, okay, we have these great quotes. Are they representative, right, of the entire group? So, at what point does the number of quotes that students might say about a topic be like, yep, we can say that this is a representative statement? And then it becomes like, well, do we count like more than half the students made this sort of statement in their experience? So, did you come up against like quantitative ideas in working with the qualitative in that way?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and that's something we talked about a little bit during this process. Because one other thing that I think might be relevant to mention is that we had, I believe, 22 matched cases that we were working with. And so we were working with a small number of cases. some had answers had more and less detail than others. And so what we were focusing on was not making statements about themes that were representative of every student who was involved in global learning programs at Haverford, but more thinking about like themes that we noticed and quotes that are representative of those themes, and
Mm.
then thinking about those as like individual experiences that students have that could lead towards recommendations for programming, but might not be representative of every student in the program. I know that's a little wishy-washy. I don't know if that is a super helpful answer to the question, but it was definitely something that was on our minds, especially as students who were new to doing qualitative research, kind of struggling with like, how do we present these themes as significant without generalizing to a sample size that we can't generalize about? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So, in addition to process, I also just wanted to mention student voice and why I felt like it was important that this was a role that was undertaken by students and sort of why that was meaningful to me, both as a student researcher and someone who has participated in these global learning programs at Haverford. Um, so first, student researchers, in this case, we were representing student perspectives. So I know a lot of times with power dynamics between students and staff or the people who run programs, like when a student researcher is in charge of this research, it evens out that hierarchy a little bit, and it is also a way for students to be able to represent their own voices. And I think for me, as someone who's taken the GES and who's been involved in these programs, like as a learner, it was meaningful to me to get to kind of look at these responses, both as someone who was in the role of the learner, but also is kind of looking at it from outside because obviously I didn't produce all of these GES responses. Um, Another thing we were thinking about is that this is an iterative and cyclical process in a demographically diverse student group. So I know I talked about this a little bit, but our differing positionalities contributed to an analysis that varied between the four of us. And since it was a collaborative process, we were able to talk about why we might have analyzed things differently or noticed different themes or might be drawn to different themes. And I know that if I'd produced the outcome on my own, it would have looked different and probably less rich than what we produced as the four of us coming from different identities and experiences and pulling all of our shared knowledge together. And then lastly, it was an opportunity for student learning and research experience. I learned so much in this group. When I took the qualitative sociology class I mentioned, I was like, I actually have some qualitative research experience I can draw from, which felt really special. So it was a really cool opportunity for me to be able to get that research experience as an undergraduate student. So those are just some reasons why I thought it was particularly unique to get this opportunity to have students analyzing student data. All right, so I know that was a lot of information. That's all the information I have to throw at you all. Now I have some questions. I'll read them out loud, and then I want to give everyone like 30 seconds to think about it and jot stuff down. And if everyone could choose just one question, maybe that sticks out to them and think a little bit about that question, and then we'll share back like 30 seconds after I finish reading them. So the first question is, what information would you want to learn from your GES qualitative data? The second question is, how could you use GES qualitative data analysis to inform programming decisions at your institution? And then my last question is there information you can gain from qualitative analysis that you might miss with quantitative analysis? And I'm also curious about the reverse, if you think there's information that you gain with quantitative analysis that might fall through the cracks with qualitative analysis. So I'll set a 30-second timer, and if one question jumps out, if all of them jump out, or if any other things from this presentation jump out, I'd love to just chat about these themes. All right. Um, you're welcome to unmute if you have any thoughts.
I'll unmute. I'll say getting students to fill out the qualitative section is a challenge. And so that I haven't spent a lot of time in our qualitative data, and certainly haven't spent time with it systematically in any way. But what struck me from my cursory glance is how much of it they didn't fill out. And I'll say, I mean, the survey is so long, and so that's not a critique. Like I understand why they didn't fill it out. And I even had a few students for the quantitative section, which isn't, I mean, it's long, but that's not that labor intensive, I don't think, to click boxes stopped. Like they submitted, like they finished part of it, but not the entire survey. And so I'll say I haven't even like like a precursor question even to getting to these questions, which is I don't have a lot of it. And some of it that I do have, I would say there's a lot of noise in it where students don't understand the difference between the GES and the formal course evaluation. And so some of the things that they complained about or commented on
Mm.
were things that were more appropriate to put on the course evaluation rather than thinking about the learning happening itself. And that's even with, you know, faculty contextualizing because we give the survey to select courses that have, have the global component. So I'm not there. I'm not at the point where I can use the data yet because I don't have a lot of it, is the point of the long missive.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely something we talked about at Haverford too. I know I don't want to put Mike on the spot. I know this was also a conversation that we had, so I don't know if you had any have any thoughts about that.
These are really good questions, and I appreciate the critique, Rebecca. Actually, the survey is long, and I do
But
think
all
that,
necessary. So not a critique. It's more just a recognition of the survey as it is and students where they're
yes.
at. So not meant to be a criticism at all. Yeah.
No, well, and that honesty I think is important because, and this is maybe one of those things. I look at that third bullet about information from qualitative versus quantitative. Like it's easier for students to respond to a quantitative question, right? And the response we get, um, and rather than one word or a phrase, it's like, okay, we got a number or a Likert scale, and so. At the same time, that it's very that quantitative way of gathering people's information is depersonalizing in some ways. It like working with numbers and looking at means tends to level people's experiences, whereas the qualitative for me provides more of a richness in individual experiences. So, of course, both are there for a reason with the mixed methods, being able to work with both. Um, and Ruhi and I are now actually at the point looking at having done the preliminary analysis, looking at like, well, what secondary questions do we ask? And look at the qualitative maybe to get those answers. So so I think it's and that's asking maybe too much of any person on this call or anyone working with the data themselves. Now, I think if you have a group like the group you're working with, being able to hold up what you found with the qualitative and then looking at the quantitative side by side could provide a more holistic look at both the trends with the quantitative and then the personalization with the qualitative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Mike.
I don't know if I answered your question, Annika, but
No, yeah, that was really helpful.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was just going to say that we at Cornell haven't really looked at the qualitative data yet. I intend to do that this summer to take a look at some of that detailed information. I'm curious kind of just what our data looks like. Um, and I think we are definitely using the GES quantity. Well, our intent is to use the GES quantitative data to inform our just programming work. And I know that there are some groups who, we have a variety of different folks using the GES here. And some I know for sure are looking at it on a regular basis for a variety of different purposes. And then I think others, because of some data quality, like not getting very many matched um, cases or getting students to complete it, similar sort of barriers, um, we are kind of trying to figure out like how we're going to use this more um, regularly. And I think we're also trying to kind of wrap this up into a larger grant initiative that would be more than just like smaller groups that are doing co-curricular work. That's who's kind of using it now. So we are considering we've done a little pilot this year that we're going to kind of look at that data this summer and see like, okay, if we do it sort of in a pointed way, we also offered this year, we offered some incentives for students to complete it because we had some grant funding, and because we were sort of piloting for a larger grant, we wanted to see if that would help encourage additional students to complete the GES, both pre and post. So they had to do the pre and the post in order to get the stipend. So we'll see how that works, how that does when we administer those post surveys.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear about that and what the results of that are.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to share what we learn back with y'all in the fall at some point.
Mhm.
I
And
I was thinking about question one, like what information would you want to learn from the GES? And given that we're using it with two on-campus classes that don't have a significant experiential learning component, but what brings the students there is that they are preparing for experiential learning, or they've had experiential learning, global experiential learning experiences. And in my work, I have learned that not everybody who is designing those experiences is including a lot of reflection. I think about our study abroad programs, which is the office that I work in partially. And so in a way, these classes are designed to rectify that in a way. Like if you didn't have a chance to reflect on your experience, now you do. Um, the the classes are complementary. Students can take both, or they can take one or the other, although they are different. One is called What's in Your Shoebox, Unpacking Your Study Away Experience. The other one is What's in Your Toolbox, The Ethics of Travel in the Context of Globalization. It's a little bit more theoretical and experiential, interestingly. Um, the shoebox is older and was designed before knowing about the GES. And the toolbox was always planned to be designed, but we designed it after learning about the GES. So one from the get-go has been designed thinking about learning outcomes like cultural humility and critical reflection. The first one, which is now 8 years old, was designed more with reflection in mind and has come to be more about critical reflection. Um, and so it's going to be interesting. And I'm not sure, Mike, if you told me we can't disaggregate or we can disaggregate because we do have matched cases, the two courses to see whether the shoebox is doing more, right? Which is the more reflective, creative writing based class, very diverse community, different global experiences, or whether the toolbox, which was more intentionally designed with similar outcomes to the GES in mind, whether that is doing more for students, or if it's doing similar things but in different ways, showing that there are different modalities or methods and modalities for getting moving students along. And Rebecca, I remember when you presented, I can't remember the details, but I remember you saying that you were particularly interested in one of the, what do you call them? Domains, right? One of
Yeah,
the
one of the
domains.
five area. Yeah.
And and that's what you were focusing on. I'm like, oh, good. So that means we can focus on cultural humility and critical reflection because I don't think we're necessarily doing the best job with global citizenship because that wasn't like the goal of these two classes. And so that's been reassuring to know that you can sort of pick the domain or domains that you're interested in learning more about. And I don't know if that's a question or a wondering or a, but I am curious about these two complementary classes that, you know, are they both doing the job? To what degree? Or is one doing it better than the other? And then why might that be? Because they are different.
That sounds really interesting. We at Haverford, in this qualitative group, only did qualitative analysis on um, course evaluations of our courses that are sort of our pre and post courses for global learning programs. But it was interesting, even just with course evaluations, to think about what students' takeaways were and what they were hoping for in a class and what they got out of the specific classes. So that sounds really interesting.
And that comment, and Francine, your question, and maybe this is a doesn't have to be a closing question, Annika, but so to clarify, you looked at qualitative responses from all of the qualitative questions, right? And okay, I'm seeing you nod. So, and it's telling, right, that in the creation of the survey, 10 of the 16 qualitative questions are in the cultural humility domain, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to learn about cultural humility using qualitative, there are questions there. Critical reflection has three. The other three are spread out on the global citizenship. So it just, I don't know, Annika, if you came up against that, but when it comes to the three domains or the eight scales, some of those lend themselves to qualitative analysis more than others, right? And did you find that in your work as well?
I think that wasn't something that I noticed, although I will say we divided our qualitative coding and analysis between the scales between people,
Mm.
so that we weren't working, like I wasn't working across scales and neither was anyone else. So I wonder if that would be a takeaway that we would have had if we'd worked across scales
Mm.
as group members. So yeah, that would be interesting. I'm happy. I would love to hear any other reflections or questions, but if there aren't any more, I can pass it back to Mike.
I'm going to stop the recording here.